Okay, so this is the Wednesday. I hear my voice echoing. I think somebody's okay. Thanks, Simon. This is the Wednesday UK Sangha call. It is 1 p.m. Central in the US. I'm not sure exactly what time it is in the UK, to be honest. I think maybe a little later in the evening, possibly 7 or 8. I'm filling in for Dhammadasa today. He had some stuff to do with his kid and some kid stuff to do. So just filling in for him. And we have 2 questions that we're going to start with. The first was about sloth and torpor, what to do to prevent sloth and torpor from arising, and then if sloth and torpor has already been seen to be arisen, then what to do with it or about it. And then the other question was about old sankharas, old complexes, old patterns of behavior arising now, and specifically about the urge to essentially dominate or feel superior to somebody else in different types of situations and contexts. So we will start with sloth and torpor. So yeah, I mean, the suttas give an answer to sloth and torpor. So I'll start with that in brief, and then I'll give a little bit more about my thoughts on it. You know, sloth and torpor is a feeling of lack of energy, a feeling of laziness, a feeling of drowsiness, a feeling of tiredness. And, you know, there are some suttas, and you know, important to understand that sloth and torpor is one of the 5 hindrances. And the 5 hindrances are called hindrances because they restrict the mind from achieving seclusion from sensuality. They restrict the mind from achieving the enlightenment factors, the jhana factors. The hindrances basically restrict the mind to its enslavement to sensuality. And so wholesome, I guess you can say. Not wholesome, but like pleasing and unpleasing states is what the hindrances tie the mind to. Prevents the mind from experiencing non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. They restrict the mind from experiencing unrestricted awareness, liberation of mind, things like that. And the hindrances are all rooted in the kilesas, the defilements, which is greed, hatred, and delusion. These are the 3 forms of craving, 3 forms that craving takes. They're sometimes called Mara's daughters. So you can think of Mara as craving. Craving, Mara, rules over sensuality. It's what keeps the mind bound to the senses, all 5 senses and the mind as well. Mano, in this case here. And so craving takes these 3 forms of greed, which is movement towards an object, desire for an object that is pleasing. It takes the form of hatred, which is movement away from something that is displeasing. And it takes the form of delusion, which is usually a state of uncertainty about a neutral feeling, and it results in a desire to distract oneself. So if we sit with a neutral feeling, we'll have a desire to distract ourselves. So the hindrances arise from our acting out on these forms of craving, acting out on greed, acting out on hatred, and acting out on delusion. So sloth and torpor falls into the delusion category of hindrances. So the fact that we live our lives unable to be okay with peace, essentially, with neutral feeling. Sorry. The fact that we live our lives unable to just sort of be okay with calm, unstimulated, neutral feeling. So that if we feel that neutral feeling, we turn on the TV, we pick up our phones and go on Discord or Facebook or whatever. I don't think people use Facebook anymore. Whatever it is, you find some way to stimulate the senses in order to distract yourself from neutral feeling, which the mind is uncertain about because it's so used to greed and hatred. the mind is so used to chasing after what is pleasing, feeding on what is pleasing, pleasing sights, pleasing sounds, pleasing flavors, pleasing sensations, pleasing ideas. My 1-year-old keeps climbing up on the trampoline that I'm sitting next to. And then it's so used to feeding on dislike and hatred of unpleasant sensations or feelings, ideas, people, sensations, whatever it may be. And as I said, distracting itself from the neutral. And so because of this habit of chasing, avoiding, spinning around in circles, the mind doesn't know what to do with neutral feeling. So the delusion aspect here is usually the mind's solution to neutral feeling is to dive into sleepiness. So it'll want to go to sleep in order to dream, so it can find stimulation in mental phenomena, or it'll go into daydreaming, so it can find stimulation again in mental phenomena. So this is where sloth and torpor comes from. It comes from our conditioning. We've conditioned ourselves to need to be stimulated all the time, right? We have this need in ourselves to be stimulated all the time, which is what sensuality is referring to. Sensuality is this logic, this belief that is implicit in the back of our minds that pursuing sensual stimulation at some point can be or that it is satisfying, right? I mean, there's no denial in the Dhamma that pleasing sights, sounds, and so on are pleasing. There's no denial that unpleasant sight, sound, sensations are displeasing, that they don't feel good. There's no denial that the mind wants to distract itself when it encounters neutral feeling like the breath or just sitting and doing nothing. But what what sensuality is, which is one of the 4 fuels for clinging, is this valuing of that. We say like, I don't want to give up my passions. That's who I am, right? I have a passion for music. I have a passion for travel. I have a passion for reading books, or I love, binge watching shows on Netflix. I love going out and having stimulating conversations. I saw a reel of that one comedian, I can't remember his name right now. He's a stand-up comic who does his shows without a shirt on. He's got a big old gut. He was talking about how much he loves drinking, how he'll never give up drinking. And he went into like all of the little details about, when you're about to get that beer and when you're sitting at brunch and they say we have bottomless mimosas. And he just went on this long, detailed rant about how much he loves drinking. And, the Buddha basically, in any summary of the teachings, talks about passion as the adhesion to samsara. Passion is like the glue that binds the mind to samsara, to this cycle of seeking and avoiding, seeking pleasure, avoidance of pain, being completely bound up in the sensual realm, intoxicated with the fabrications of our engagement with the sense realm. And so because of that habit, because of that value, when you don't have some form of stimulation, then you go into one of the hindrances. And sloth and torpor, as I said, as a common, just a place the mind seeks stimulation, just to keep it, to shorten it up a little bit. Thank you.
Michael, Michael, just to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if it's just me. I had my hand up just because I wanted to let you know you're at the wrong angle. You're vertical for me. I don't know if that's the same for everyone. There you go.
Yeah, so
Game changer.
Just trying to make you guys pay attention. Okay. So in order to not experience sloth and torpor, then you have to take the Buddha's advice, practice sense restraint, moderation in eating, moderation in sleeping, right? Because when we delight in eating our fill of food, it makes us lazy and tired. When we delight in sleep, then the mind will seek sleep or daydreaming for a form of stimulation. You can make a practice or a habit out of when morning comes, instead of like wanting to stay in bed and stay warm and stay comfortable, just get out of bed, and sort of create a distance in the relationship between what you do, what you intend, and what state or mood the mind is in. So that's sort of like it really comes down to having a different lifestyle if you don't want the mind to get in the habit of going into sloth and torpor. So that's sort of where it comes from and how to prevent it from coming. There's other things you can do, contemplate or when sloth and torpor has arisen. There's a couple things they say in the suttas, like imagine light, create the perception of light. And these are people the Buddha is speaking to, their lives are already restrained. Most of them are already sotapanna. They already have restrained lives. And so if they're experiencing sloth and torpor, it's probably because they're practicing too hard, they're not sleeping enough, they're eating too much, or the mind is maybe off its circadian rhythm or something. So he tells them to create the perception of light in the mind. That doesn't necessarily help for people who are, bound up in sensuality, unrestrained in everything that they do. So that's why I think it's difficult for that advice to help meditators who don't live a highly restricted lifestyle. So you can try that. I don't know if it will work, but I think that all those things I discussed prior is, paying attention to what you allow the mind to feed on, what you allow the mind to delight in. And that is a good way. So I mean, like, look, if you have someone who watches TV all day and you give them a book, they're not going to be able to pay attention to a book. If you have someone who plays video games all day and you give them a book or just their breath, they're not going to be able to settle their mind on the breath or the book, right? If you have someone who reads all day and you give them the breath as a meditation object, that's going to be a little bit more subtle and more difficult for them to settle their mind on, but it's more subtle than reading a book. So whatever level of stimulation you're used to, the more subtle levels of stimulation are going to be difficult for the mind to settle on. And that being said, though, there's a deeper solution to all of this, and which is essentially to understand the whole realm of sensuality and the whole sort of unfolding of the hindrances to be rooted in our habit of acting out on greed, hatred, and delusion, and how acting out on greed, hatred, and delusion essentially strengthens the sense of ownership that the mind has over the aggregates. And because of that sense of ownership that is coming from craving and clinging, that's what leads to suffering, and then the suffering leads to more seeking sensuality as a relief to suffering. So you have to break that spell that some form of entertainment or stimulation is going to put an end to suffering. It's only going to temporarily soften its sting, essentially, but then it's also the cause of suffering. So then you kind of get stuck into this cycle. So breaking that spell of sensuality by understanding deeply the Four Noble Truths, and then even further understanding the teaching on anatta, the teaching on non-ownership, there can be created a distance between there could be an understanding that whatever has arisen is already enduring there on its own, so that that because it's there on its own and your knowledge of it is secondary to its presence, it's inherently impossible to own. This is what the anatta teaching is all about. It's inherently impossible to own, impossible to control, impossible to gain any satisfaction from. And so anything that arises in your experience will be seen to be already there, persisting on its own, and the desire to feed on it or the desire to resist it will go away. But that's a bit of a deeper understanding that comes through paying attention to experience with a mind that's already been cooled down and clarified through sense restraint. The analogy that I like to use is that bottle of Italian vinaigrette dressing that is made up of oil, vinegar, and a bunch of seasonings. You know, we're constantly, through sensuality, we're constantly shaking that bottle, and so everything is mixed up and muddled. But when we practice a certain degree of restraint, you know, with the precepts as a guide, then it's like putting that bottle of vinaigrette down and giving it time to settle still. Then the oil, the vinegar, and the seasonings will all separate out, and it will clarify that each of these exist in separate domains, so that that each of these qualities of mind exist in separate domains. But the most important thing to discern is that the sense of self, the sensation of self, is a dependently arisen phenomena that is secondary to all of the other phenomena that we experience at the level of mind and body. And when that can be seen clearly, then it helps to uproot any interest in clinging to sensuality, clinging to views, clinging to self-view, clinging to practices and precepts. Those are the four fuels, the four feeding grounds for craving. So I don't want to go too much further on that question. Are there any questions about what I said, or any clarification about what I said that's needed, or anything you guys want to say about it? How you guys deal with sloth and torpor?
Maybe I'll just a couple of questions. I think the first one, sorry, I just would you mind just repeating that connection between the mind is unsure of what to do when it's in that neutral state? Because I think that's something I can definitely resonate with when you're especially when I'm in a, it's all very well when I kind of make a bit of a purposeful decision to, you know, meditate or to take a step away from my laptop or whatever, you know, at the end of the day or the beginning of the day. But I find throughout the day, you know, that neutral state that is just constantly looking for something to distract it, is something, it definitely resonates with me, because I find, particularly with, you know, YouTube and whatever, there's just constantly something to feed that distraction, and it's something that I really struggle with. So if you could just, if you don't mind, just sort of repeating that bit about how is that sloth, what's the connection between me, you know, watching yet another YouTube video that I don't really need to watch, and sloth and torpor? That would be one question, and then the follow-up one would be, based on your experience or anyone else in this group, what actually works? Because I try weaning myself off this stuff, and to give you an example, I'm currently not checking any news sites, right? So I've really weaned myself off the news. But what I find is, because of that neutral state that I get in, I end up sort of just replacing it with like, there's this like secondhand online clothes store in the UK that's really popular at the moment. I just find myself browsing stuff that I don't even need. So I kind of cut out one thing and then replace it with another. And so that can be a little bit...
that's called samsara.
Yeah, exactly. The wheel, it's very much there. So yeah, I guess just any thoughts on, based on your experience, what living in the world, in this busy world with all of its distractions, what has worked for other people to get better at this, even if we haven't perfected it yet?
I can let anybody else go first, because I know I have a tendency to
go
on for a while.
First, then, for me, firstly, I'm not the best to give advice on this, because I do also watch a lot of YouTube videos. But like you, I don't engage in news, because I found it very just unnecessary for me. Like, I'll get news dripped in for me from like my friends and for other content, but like news sites directly, nah, I don't check those. But in general, to break that samsara chain, for me, what works is just reminding myself for what my intention is. Like, if I'm on YouTube and I'm feeling curious and I want to learn about something, my intention is, oh, I'm learning something, so I'm going to pay attention to that YouTube video. But it means when I'm watching that YouTube video, I'm not doing anything else. Like, I'm like, as much as I can, fully digesting that information, thinking about like what notes I would make, almost treating it like a lecture rather than just a YouTube video. And that way, if I find something like not engaging enough or stimulating enough to treat like a lecture, I will stop watching it, because it's like, it's not worth my time. It's not meeting up to my intention, so I'm not going to continue giving it my attention. So figuring out and realizing what my intention is leads me to direct my attention with a lot more certainty and control than just whatever the winds of the internet sends my way. Like, TikTok is very non-intentional. Like, it doesn't really have a lot of intentions when you scroll TikTok, because like you're just getting a random video, random video, random video. Like, you can't base intention around just random algorithm. So yeah, just think about what your intentions are when you consume content, and try have that align. Try have the content align with your intention, and I think it will become slightly easier. At least for me, it has.
Yeah, intentions are very important to be aware of. And, you know, that second factor of the Noble Eightfold Path, and also, you know, the precepts, they're all related to intentions, you know, so the precepts are related to intentions, intentionally harming, intentionally stealing, intentionally lying, intentionally cheating, or, you know, over, you know, misindulgence in sexual or sensual conduct, and intentionally intoxicating the mind. That second path factor, right intention, is the only intention there is non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion. So that's that. So the precepts, the intentions related to the precepts are related to mundane right view. And the intentions related to that second path factor come from super mundane or noble right view. And in the pre-stream entry realm of the precepts, intentions are personal. And in the sort of post-noble right view, Sammasankappa, intentions are seen as, you know, dependently arisen, not me, not mine. The sense of self is seen to come secondary to intentions. But to make it concrete, the whole samsara that we're talking about is rooted in the relationship between, because every factor on the 12-link chain of dependent origination, which is just the broad principle of dependent origination of with this there is this, that everything, all phenomena are, you know, concurrently dependent or concurrently arisen phenomena, meaning they all exist together with another condition, essentially. And so seeing through the lens of dependent origination, that noble right viewing, is seeing things to endure as they are together with their causes and conditions, so that we can understand their cessation. But the 12-link chain of dependent origination is a specific case of this principle related to the arising of suffering, which is where the Buddha focuses teaching. So dependent origination is a broad principle, it's a universal principle. But as the Buddha said in the handful of leaves simile, he focused his teaching on the dependent origination of suffering. If you understand suffering completely and you understand its origin, then you understand its cessation and the path leading to its cessation. Because when you understand a phenomena completely, together with its causes and conditions, then you have no doubt or perplexity about what it is, where it came from, how to deal with it, right? So that's why seeing through the lens of dependent origination eliminates any need for a view about anything, because views are sort of mental constructs. They're positions, they're theories. They're not based off of present observation. Second here, this is what these are for. This is an illustration of the relationship between Mano and Citta, by the way. So you guys can read into that as much as you want. So the key here in this experience of samsara that we're talking about, of perpetually seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, it's all in that relationship between the craving and clinging links of dependent origination. So feeling is implicit, right? As long as you have a mind and a body, as long as you have mentality and materiality and consciousness of that, whether it's in the human state, the animal state, or any of the deva realms, if you want to go into any of that, then there's going to be feeling present. There's going to be form, feeling, perception, thinking, and consciousness. These are the aggregates of experience. So those are all there. They're there as such. They're real as such. And so mundane right view is there so that we don't get into a form of nihilism or denialism, where it's like, oh, nothing's really here, nothing's really real, it's all just an illusion, that kind of stuff. Mundane right view is the Buddha asking us first to acknowledge like the reality of what's present, because getting into a view about everything is just made up of emptiness and everything isn't real, that's just another avenue. That's a view that craving takes to avoid suffering. And the avoidance of suffering, craving itself is the avoidance of dukkha, and that is what perpetuates dukkha. But this relationship between craving and clinging that I want to talk about, the whole reason that we crave sensuality, that that we feed on sensual experience, sensual stimulation, that we cling to views and opinions, that we cling to theories of self, what is the self, what is not the self, whether it be there is a self or there's no self. Those are both views, neither of which the Buddha taught. Whether we're clinging to sensuality, to views and opinions, to doctrines or theories of self, or to practices and precepts, which is like, when you challenge somebody on the practice that they do, they cling to it, right? The reason that we cling to those things, it's all because existence is born of craving and clinging, right? We want that sense of existence. We want to feel a sense of existence. We want to exist as the one who is, the one who, like, as a liberal or a conservative or a Democrat or a Republican or a Christian or an American or a Buddhist, or someone who loves Pepsi and not Coke, or someone who loves Coke and not Pepsi. We want to exist. And these, this is all the way at the form of birth, right, where it's become an identity. But prior to that, just that feeling of existence comes from the feeding of craving on one of these four fuels, right? The feeding of craving on sensual stimulation. We experience a sense of existence when we are stimulating the senses. We experience a sense of existence when we are clinging to views and opinions. We experience a sense of existence when we're clinging to doctrines of self or not, or no self. We experience a sense of existence when we're clinging to practices and precepts, like the right way of doing things, essentially. And it is our addiction to feeling that sense of existence that makes it, that's what we're not interrogating. We're not interrogating our addiction to, and then, so there's the four fuels of craving or clinging that I just mentioned: sensuality, views and opinions, doctrines of self, practices and precepts. And then there's the three modes of craving for sensuality, that's sensory experience, craving for existence, right? Some realm of being, whether it be the animal realm, the human realm, the deva realm, which you can think of as different states of mind in this present life, or non-existence, which is you know, deep sleep, even daydreaming, all the way down to thoughts of suicide, you know, this craving for non-existence. And so those are the three forms of craving. So this is the sort of net of samsara that our lives are caught in, and this is like the mind completely intoxicated with this aspect of the chain of dependent origination. And as long as we keep feeding, you know, as long as we keep fueling craving, essentially, we keep giving it what it wants, then we continue to exist. And as long as we continue to exist, we continue to experience birth. And as long as we continue to experience birth, we experience aging, illness, death, sorrow, pain, grief, lamentation, despair, this whole massive suffering. As the Buddha summarizes it, these 5 domains of experience as a whole afflicted by clinging, which, you know, is possessiveness or identification. And there's an analogy for this. Death, the experience of non-clinging is what the Buddha calls the deathless. The experience of non-craving, non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, non-clinging. This is what the Buddha calls the deathless. And a good analogy for this is, just to put a cap on this, is, and you know, it doesn't illustrate it perfectly, but just think of like a relationship between 2 people. And in the beginning, when you call the love innocent, there's a lot of joy, right? It's not necessarily a great analogy because passion is involved, but it is. But as soon as the passion increases, right, then possessiveness enters. It's because of the people's passion for one another that they then become possessive, and that just chokes the love away, right? There's no possibility to experience love in the sense of metta, essentially, which love is a bad translation, you could say, just goodwill, essentially. There's no way to experience that in the presence of possessiveness. And this possessiveness is, like, I like to say, it's like a mental illness or like a demon that lives inside of us. It takes possession of everything. It's what creates death. That's why the Buddha says that the unmindful are as though dead. Then the mindful, you know, don't experience death, because the mindful use the Dhamma appropriately at each moment of contact, at each experience of the aggregates, in order to prevent craving and clinging from arising. So there's no birth and there's no death. That's what the experience of the deathless is. So that's why, you know, as soon as the aging and death of whatever last birth starts to kind of come to cessation, there's like an alarm that goes off in you, and you're like, okay, I need to watch a YouTube video, or I need to like go up and go do something, or I need to daydream, or I need to proliferate even about the Dhamma sometimes, or whatever it may be. You do something to stimulate one of the 6 sense doors, or the 6 sense bases, in order to prevent craving from ceasing. But the cessation of craving is what gives you the experience of nibbana. It's just most people have never experienced it, and so they don't know what it feels like. And so their whole way of living is the maintenance of existence, and this is what creates the underlying fear and anxiety, because you're maintaining this thing that is, you know, fragilely dependently arisen, and it's exhausting. That's why there's sloth and torpor. That's why Sekas, those who've seen the Dhamma and beyond, only sleep 2 to 3 hours a night, because they're not tired, because they're not maintaining this sense of existence by feeding these 4 forms of clinging. So that's, you know, that's one aspect of the chain of causation that leads to our dukkha, this existential anxiety of trying to maintain that which is difficult to maintain and difficult to endure. and impossible to control. That's those three characteristics of existence.
I have a question. I think you mentioned something about like when your mind is like in a neutral state, looking for something to cling on to. Sometimes it clings on to suicidal thoughts, and I thought that was very interesting because sometimes I get this feeling like. So to preface, on the whole, I'm a very like joyful person, right? I go about each day living as joyfully and effortlessly as possible in like the spirit of the Dhamma. But then every so often I get this weird feeling of, I feel like I've lived enough. Like I would be happy to die now. I don't know if I would describe that as a suicidal thought, but at the same time it seems strange to me because I have meditated upon my death and I'm kind of okay with it, but in a sense that it's like I don't want to die, but if I don't see tomorrow, I'm also content. Would that be considered the brain in a neutral state latching on to dying? Because I feel like it is, right?
Well, this is the importance of the mundane right view, in that though the experience as a whole depends on the body is also an experience in the mind. They codepend, and the Buddha, when he speaks of rebirth, he speaks of like a fire being carried by the wind. He would say that fire is wind sustained, and so when the body breaks up, the being is craving sustained. So as long as craving exists in the heart, we can't solve suffering through the death of the body. So that's an important aspect of mundane right view, because physical death isn't a solution to the problem. But to answer your question more specifically, when the Dhamma is seen, when dependent origination is seen, it dissolves any thought of life after death or life ending after death. Life continuing after death falls away. The self continuing after death dissolves away, or the world continuing without me after death dissolves away. Because what's seen is that both the world and the self are born within this fathom-long body, within this constituents of experience, dependent on craving that is rooted in ignorance and clinging. That becomes clear to the mind. Sorry, the sun just parted through the clouds, so I'm blind now. But so that when that is seen clearly, the thought that that eternalist sense of existence of wanting to experience other lives or a life in heaven or fearing a life in hell or whatever it may, that goes away. Or the annihilationist view of like, I'm okay with dying because I'm at peace with my experience ending. That's still a conceptualization of death rooted in a sense of existence that's rooted in craving, that's rooted in ignorance. So all of those types of assumptions, you can say conceptualizations or conceivings, the Buddha calls it, those all go away. He says to Vajragota, to all of his questionings, that the Tathagata, the one thus gone, the Buddha, has no positions. He's done away with all positions. He's done away with all I-making, all mind-making, all obsessions with conceit, and all conceiving, he says. So when you perceive directly, this is suffering, this is the origination of suffering, this is the cessation of suffering, this is the path leading to cessation of suffering, then there's no conceiving. Or when you perceive this is birth, dependent on existence, birth arises, dependent on clinging, existence arises dependent on craving, clinging dependent on feeling, craving, and so forth, down to ignorance, then no conceiving. So what he's saying is, in all of that, is that if you're looking at a fire And you know that because there's fuel, there's heat, and there's oxygen, fire comes to be. And when you remove fuel, heat, or oxygen, the fire goes out. Then you're not going to think that, you know, like, where was the fire before? Where is it now? Where is it after? Those are the conceivings that go away. It's the same thing with the sense of self-existence that goes away upon the scene of dependent origination, because it's that sense of existence that is born of this concurrence of conditions that the Buddha describes in dependent origination. So I don't know if that answers your question, but let me see if I can block that sun.
I mean, yeah, it makes sense, right? Like,
There we go.
essentially, once you actually let go of that craving, it's not even a thought that comes to mind. Essentially, what you're saying, right?
Well, when it's been abandoned for long enough for the mind to clear up enough to kind of see dependent origination clearly, then it becomes then conceiving, or sort of, as Dhammarato would say, making things up. That goes away. And very importantly, what makes it impossible to suffer at that point is that all sense of ownership goes away, or ownability. What's there is what's there, and it's seen to be already there, enduring while changing prior to your awareness of it. So your sense of knowing, your sense of self, having come to know any phenomena, is always seen then as secondary to the phenomena, which makes it makes it inherently unownable, and then illogical. The whole realm of sensuality becomes irrational, because if, let's say, you encounter the mind in a bad mood, there's the mind in a bad mood. It was already there in a bad mood before I was aware of it, so why do anything about it? You encounter the mind in a good mood. It was already there, enduring in a good mood. I can go turn my attention this way, come back. Oh, the mind is still in a bad mood, or oh, it's still in a good mood. It becomes, you become dispassionate towards the changing moods of the mind. You become dispassionate towards the senses. They're seen to be organisms in an environment doing their thing. You're restraining them because their feeding is fueling craving and clinging. But they're seen as not me, not mine, right? Like the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body, the mind. They're at first, through the practice of virtue, restrained, but once dependent origination is seen clearly, they don't even really stir up anymore. They sort of become still on their own. The mind becomes still on its own, because you're not fueling it with craving and clinging, essentially. Yeah, go ahead, Edward. I can see now.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, one thing I would like to have a better distinction on is, when do I genuinely need rest, and when is it like sloth? Is there like something Buddha said about that?
Yeah, at first, a lot of your tiredness is craving born. I mean, it's getting past the point where everything you think, feel, and do is born of craving. That takes like a training of the mind, right? Because with the Buddha, I mean, there's different names for mind, but the mind in this situation that I'm referring to is what the Buddha calls the Citta, which is like the more sort of primordial or fundamental aspect of mind. And it's, it is, it's going to throw a fit when you don't give it what it wants. And it's going to get sleepy when you don't give it the food that it's used to getting. So at first, a lot of your sloth and torpor, a lot of your sleepiness, your drowsiness, your laziness is ways in which that craving pressures you, inflicts influence on you in order to give it what it wants, right? So craving wants to, it wants some form of stimulation. Maybe it's already made up something that it wants. And, this is why it's just switching out, just renouncing like little bits of things don't work. Like, okay, I'm not going to watch TV. I'm not going to listen to music. I'm not going to read books, but I'm going to, I'm going to, I got distracted by my daughter. One second here. She's getting tired. So,
Sloth and Torpor.
here. She's getting a little fussy. So we're talking about sloth and torpor, and repeat the question, because when she starts fussing, my brain stops.
Oh yeah. How does one know when they genuinely need rest and when it's just sloth in disguise or torpor in disguise, or it would be unskillful to rest?
And you were
Yeah.
just at the point where you were saying that that's why swapping out one thing for another doesn't work.
Yeah, essentially, the analogy would be like, let's say you were diagnosed with diabetes, and you're like, okay, I'm going to stop eating cake and brownies and cookies, but I'm going to continue having Kit Kats and Snickers. You're not getting at like the root there. That you should just not have sugar. Or let's say that you're trying to deal with like having too much weight on your body for your own particular health, and same example, it's the like you're eating 4,000 calories a day, and you stop eating cake and ice cream, and but you're instead eating like big giant bowls of pasta at night. You're still giving yourself 4,000 calories. So just restricting certain foods that craving feeds on is not going to stop craving. I mean, craving can sustain itself on just one thing, like for the rest of your life. You can take everything away and just give it one avenue to feed, and it'll just feed on that. This is what distinguishes the Dhamma from a lot of other religions, because the Buddha closed every door on craving by not taking a position on consciousness or the self, because oftentimes that's sort of the last avenue for craving to go and establish a sense of self, right? Concepts like pure awareness and things like that. Not to say that there's no such a thing as pure awareness, but to say that if you take that on as a view, then you've given craving a view to feed on. So until you've, to answer Edward's question, until you've been able to sequester the mind afflicted with craving, the citta afflicted with craving, through enough restraint and allowed it to sort of calm down temporarily, you essentially can't distinguish between a hindrance and an actual need for sleep. It's very difficult. So what you can do is you can sort of define your, like they do in AA, they define their sobriety. You can sort of define your boundaries. So you could say like, okay, I'm going to sleep, for however many hours you think your body needs. And when I go to sleep, just going to go to sleep. And when I wake up, I'm going to wake up. I'm not going to like linger in bed. I'm not going to delight or indulge in sleep. When I say delight, it's like, I'm not gonna, like, you're not going to like be passionate about sleeping, because that conditions the mind to see sleep as a food. Essentially, it gives craving. Sleep becomes a fuel for craving. And then also in eating, this is another area the Buddha talks about related to sloth and torpor. If any of you guys have ever tried intermittent fasting, eating is such a root fundamental need but it's also a fuel for craving. And so finding a way to balance that can really isolate craving so that you can see where it's at. So if you try like intermittent fasting, for example, where you give yourself like in short eating window and like fasting hours, or like they do in the Theravada tradition, they don't eat after noon essentially, and they don't eat to the point where they're extremely full. The food reflection says that, you know, food is only going to be used to keep the body healthy, to support and sustain the spiritual life, and to get rid of the unpleasant feeling and not stir up new ones. That line is about attenuating hunger, but not creating the discomfort of overeating. It doesn't say it specifically, but that's what it's referring to quell unpleasant feelings, hunger, and to not stir up new ones, which is like that overeating, feeling sick and full and overtired. So, you know, you create boundaries in these necessary requisites of sleeping and eating. And, you know, and just to kind of bring it down to Dhammarato language for a little bit, because I know I can get real technical with dependent origination, things like that. When Dhammarato talks about being satisfied, at least the way that I understand it, he's talking about undermining craving at its root. So craving is going to tell you that you need to do things, you need to get things, you need to acquire things, you need to be things or be someone. And but if you can get in the habit of being okay with things as they are, not mean, you know, to clarify, that doesn't mean being okay with, you know, eating everything you want to eat or watching everything you want to watch, or just going with the grade of craving, but being okay not feeding craving. Essentially, it's going to hurt at first, but that's how you sort of figure out where it is, and you sort of break the spell that it has on you. So you have to break the spell that craving has on you in order to distinguish or to discern between genuine need for food or sleep and what craving is giving rise to. You know, just to make my fussy 1-year-old into a teachable moment here. You know, the Buddha compares the citta, the mind, the more the feeling, sort of the fundamental feeling mind, not the thinking aspect of the mind, which he calls the mano. He compares it to a wild animal, and it is the citta afflicted with craving that is constantly pressuring, you know, you to feed it. And you know, your thoughts, when not able to discern it, are conditioned by the citta. So you know, the example he gives is like an elephant in India and Thailand. They do this when an elephant is going through puberty. It basically loses its mind, and they tie it to a tree or a post until it finishes going through puberty so that it can clear up. So you create these restrictions, these restraints, in order to cool and tame the citta. And that's why you get that image in older traditions of like, or I mean like northern traditions, like of like the sage riding atop the ox. When the citta has been calmed and cooled and liberated from craving, then you can sort of just like relax, because it's not going to be there fussing at you all the time. Or like if you're training a puppy and you're not constantly feeding the puppy everything it wants to the point where it starts whining and barking, you know, you use a crate, you use different forms of training to get the dog to have, as Cesar Millan would say, rules, boundaries, and limitations. And you know, he says, you know, no touch, no talk, no eye contact, to states of mind that you don't want the dog to have, and then you give touch, talk, and eye contact to the states of mind you do want to have. That's the relationship in that virtue stage of practice that you have to the mind, in getting it to not dominate your life with its chronic dissatisfaction, with it being dissatisfied all the time and always having to feed it constantly. You just can't rest. You can't relax if you have a poorly trained puppy or a spoiled child or an untamed mind that does nothing but want, need, cry all the time. So this is why, prior to the arising of the supramundane right view, that the precepts are important, because they sort of mimic the type of behavior that a mind that's not continuously fueling craving behaves like. So if you think to yourself about the precepts and you feel like, oh, I don't want to do that, like that bugs me to even think about the idea of like not, what's it called? Just the five basic precepts, or even the 8, maybe once every 2 weeks. The fact that you don't want to do that is because you're still heavily bound to, to the whole realm of craving and sensuality. So, to shorten my answer, Edward, it's just you can't discern it when you're under that intoxication. Now my other child's here now.
And in terms of sort of weaning yourself off craving, it's not, you can't just be like, well, books are slightly, rather than like binge watching YouTube, books are a healthier form of craving, so I'll do that. Is it better, just, do you think, from your personal experience or whatever, like to just literally try and go cold turkey for 1 day a week, and then increase that to 2 days a week, and just go, that way you're really eradicating the craving itself, rather than just as much as you can by living in the world without without substituting it for something else?
Eventually you need to get to the point where you're not doing anything, none of your actions are motivated by greed, hatred, delusion. But it is a gradual training for a reason. And so the concept of weaning is, I think, a good concept. I sort of been doing this for a long time, I guess you can say. So I kind of want to just be like, just get to this part right here. Like, just throw it all away, throw the world away, throw doctrines of self away. Just get out of that spell and intoxication of craving and see things as they are right now. Like, I always have this tendency to like want to kind of like to go there, but the Buddha was wiser than I am. And he did teach a gradual training, right? He did teach sort of like a weaning away of fuel for craving, essentially. And it also just depends on the person. If somebody has a higher aptitude towards wisdom, then you can put them in the right set of circumstances for a short period of time, like a retreat, like a 10-day silent retreat, and they could see the thing that just undermines it all, and go straight to it, like where you don't have to be a disciplined person and you get the understanding. But if you've gotten there without the discipline, then there's still so much conditioning that the mind will get sucked back in to its old habits, and the wisdom will fall into the background until you can sort of bring the path back into balance. So this is why the Buddha taught, Sīla, Samādhi, and Pañña. The virtue, typically understood as sense restraint. In Dhammarato's approach, it's just this devotion to being satisfied with things as they are. It's an attitude of satisfaction to undermine craving. So that's another way of communicating that I think he's been very effective with a lot of people. And but there's not going to be an end to this maintenance of your well-being. You're not going to get to a point where it maintains itself until you get the you know, the vision of the Dhamma, essentially. The Buddha even talks about the jhanas as not being permanently liberating. He talks about ceto vimutti, which is liberation of mind through jhana, essentially, because while you're in jhana, there's no experience of self, there's no craving. You're basically experiencing something very much like nibbana when you're in the jhanas. Especially the fourth jhana, he says it's the closest thing to nibbana without being nibbana that a person can experience. And you know, those jhanas existed outside of Buddhism. The reason he didn't accept those as his teaching is because they're temporary. You know, there's this criteria for the Buddha Dhamma is unconditioned liberation, permanent, irreversible, unconditioned liberation. This is what makes it you know, fully distinguished from every other form of stress relief, stress management, you know, general well-being, just different ways of life that are perfectly fine, you know, for having a good, happy life. But as far as the teachings in early Buddhism, the Buddha stressed not accepting anything that is conditional for liberation. So what's necessary for unconditional liberation is what he calls Pañña vimutti, which is liberation by wisdom, which is liberation through seeing clearly, seeing the three characteristics of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not self, which come from seeing the Four Noble Truths and dependent origination. And these things cannot be seen by a mind that is intoxicated in its normal way of being. It requires an entire change of lifestyle. And the instructions are quite clear. You see a lot of people are confused. Okay, what do I do then? What do I do? It's like, well, you know, the instructions are quite clear. You know, you do what you need to do to satisfy the four requisites of life, you know, food, shelter, medicines, and what am I missing? And in lay life, those have bigger expressions, you know, you also have duties to family and things like that, to your job. You do what's needed to satisfy those needs, but you kind of practice undermining craving within that way of life. But like I said, if you're able to get clear instructions on the Dhamma, and you take those instructions and you use them to pay attention to, as the Buddha says, yoniso manasikara, to the source of experience, and you practice Dhamma in accordance with Dhamma, you know, you practice the instructions correctly in balance, then you'll gain that knowledge that makes it impossible for these sources of suffering to continue coming up. Then the practice maintains itself. Then there's no need for, you know, holding on to certain practices and precepts. There's no need to hold on to certain views. There's no need to hold on. There's no need for no doubt is possible at that point, because the mind has seen to a certain point that the liberation then becomes unconditional. Okay, she wants a nap. This is what you call genuine sleepiness, not sloth and torpor. There's two ways I like to put these things that you see. One, you see through the Four Noble Truths that the whole value, the whole logic of sensuality is absurd. There's no end to dissatisfaction. There's nothing that you can give dissatisfaction that it will permanently satisfy it, you know, and that dissatisfaction is there to fuel that sense of existence. So as soon as you give it what it wants, it's going to create something else. If you want to watch a YouTube video, then while you're watching the YouTube video, you might think of another YouTube video you want to watch, or something you want to eat, or something you want to do. You know, so you have to see the bottomlessness of dissatisfaction. That's one important thing to see. that's rooted in seeing the Four Noble Truths, that, you know, the single source of suffering is craving, this perpetual dissatisfaction. But then there's also the scene of the fact that the sense of ownership is born of craving, but it's also the source of craving. They're kind of like feeding each other. And so being able to see the impossibility of ownership in all phenomena undermines that sense of ownership. And then when the sense of ownership is undermined, there's no then you can't be touched by suffering, essentially. Unpleasant feeling can arise, pleasant feeling can arise, neutral feeling can arise, and you're just okay with it being there. It doesn't really touch you, because you know it's not you, it's not yours, it's not controllable. You know that views are not you or yours. You know, everything sort of stands on its own. It's dependently arisen, but it's there on its own, happening on its own. It doesn't need your involvement. As the Buddha says in the Bahia Sutta, you don't put yourself in it. You're not with it. You're not the owner of it. You know, you just sort of see the broader context of experience, that your sense of self is the shadow of, and it undermines your ability to feel it's always there already. So if a habit of clinging tries to arise within your experience, that knowledge that's always there in the background puts a stop to it on its own. So you get to this point where the practice basically kind of maintains itself, and then all that's left to do at that point is to continue reducing the lingering shallow roots of craving that are there, the habits of craving that are there, and a continual remembering of the Dhamma, of dependent origination, of the Four Noble Truths, of the three characteristics, impermanence, uncontrollability, unsatisfactoriness, and unownability. I feel like this whole recording is going to have her whining voice in the background, so I apologize. But if anything, it's a demonstration that one can practice on expert mode and still be successful. I have found that if I was to use Buddhadasa's language, that the poison that's inside our experience, the disease, the mental illness, the demon, I've called it many different things, and you have to develop this sort of like this fed upness with it. It's the demon of selfishness. Selfishness, the way we use it colloquially, is it doesn't really capture like what the scene of that selfishness is like. It's self-centeredness, I guess you can say, where everything is about me, about my pleasure, about my views and opinions, about my way of life, my wants and needs, my dissatisfaction and my satisfaction, my enlightenment or non-enlightenment, my status, my gain and loss, all of that stuff. When that mindness goes away, that's when the liberation becomes unconditional. I think that's probably the last thing I'll say, because I know she needs a nap. And now my 3-year-old is also yelling at me. I don't know if you guys can hear him. The repetition of dada.
Thank you so much, Michael. It was a delight to hear you talk today.
Oh, thank you. I know my style is different than Dhammarato, so I apologize if you guys were coming here hoping for Dhammarato.
Always welcome. It's always welcome.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot. I learned a lot. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Have a great day, guys. Bye.
You guys have a good day.
Bye.